Welcome to Spotlight on Climate. Today we have with us Dr. Zach Brown from the Tidelines Institute, and we're talking to him in a remote location in Alaska off Davis Base. Welcome to Spotlight on Climate, Dr. Brown. Is that what we call you?
Thank you very much. That's fine. You can call me Zach.
Okay.
And I'm honored to be here.
Thank you for joining us. And, I would like you to spend a little time first to introduce yourself, tell a little bit about yourself. Growing up in Alaska, I know is a big point for me because I grew up there too. And so, just tell us a little bit about Dr. Brown or Zach. And also,
I will do. And as you mentioned, I'm calling in from a very remote location here in Alaska, and I'm on a remote island in the middle of the wilderness. If any of your listeners have heard of Glacier Bay, we're near there, and it's this incredibly wild area of big tidewater glaciers and big rivers with salmon running up them and grizzly bears fishing in those rivers. So it's just a spectacular place, one I was very, very lucky to grow up in. And, we ended up here at this extremely remote village of about 400 people with no roads to it called Gustavus. I was amazed to learn that you know some people from Gustavus because not too many people do. But it's way out on the edge of the continent. And, we ended up there because my parents were both with the National Park Service. And so my mom would go up on these tour ships to the glaciers and tell people about John Muir coming to Alaska to see the glaciers because he knew glaciers had carved his beloved Sierra Nevada range down in California, and he wanted to come see glaciers in action. And she told them about the grizzly bears, she told them about the salmon, but she told them about the glaciers. And of course, even at that time, those glaciers were melting, and that process continues and accelerates today. And so climate science was just kind of daily life. I grew up around it. And now I ended up from there, I fell in love with the natural world in this area. I had green blood. Well, I ended up going into climate science. I was at Stanford University for my graduate studies, and I got to travel to the Arctic and Antarctic seas. I got to run around with polar bears and penguins and drill ice cores, and it just very wild, adventuresome, very sexy science. I got to go to places that very few will ever get to see, and I thought this was just the coolest adventure in the world. But, turns out that the Arctic and Antarctic seas are the fastest warming places on Earth, and you spend a little time in this field, and it's like, oh, okay, we are in a crisis. Now, the ice pack, particularly of the Arctic, is melting very rapidly. We watched that in real time while I was in graduate school, and has implications for not just locally but for global climate and accelerates global warming. And I was seeing all of this, and eventually it felt too, at the time, this was some 10, 15 years ago that I was in graduate school, especially at the time, it felt like, we're in a crisis and nobody seems to be doing very much about it either. And I couldn't quite square that circle. I didn't really understand, and certainly I wasn't doing very much about it. I was computing statistics in a basement office and publishing these papers that brought me success as a scientist, but they were going to only be read by a handful of other people. It certainly wasn't going to slow the amount of carbon flowing into the atmosphere. It wasn't going to stop my homeland from warming. Alaska, by the way, is the fastest warming state now, warming at twice the rate of the lower 48, as we say. So I ended up leaving academia, leaving science, because I just felt that wasn't where I was going to make a difference. I didn't want to just document the problems of this world. I wanted to actively work to change those ideas and to change those problems. And I didn't know what that would look like, but I decided to go home to Alaska with the idea that this place inspired me as a child. What if I could share that with others? And I ended up going home to Alaska. I founded a nonprofit organization called Tidelines Institute, which I now run together with my wife. And we bring student groups here, bring them into this wild area, help to touch their hearts.
I think we got interrupted, so we'll call him back. And he is on a satellite phone, so we'll just call him back.
My apologies.
Oh, no, you don't have to apologize. I'm sure something was running around in the air, interrupting our call. So we got you back. I told the audience that we were going to do that, and we have a pretty patient audience. So go ahead with what you were saying. And I believe you were talking about the Tidelines Institute. And if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Dr. Zach Brown on Spotlight on Climate, and he's in a remote location in Alaska, in Glacier Bay, Alaska. So continue on with what you were saying. You're telling us about Tidelines Institute and some of the things, action that it's committing to.
Thank you. Yeah, I was saying that I walked away from the scientific, from the academic world, and I went home to Alaska to found Tidelines Institute, which I now run together with my wife, Laura, and we bring student groups into this remote area of Alaska, into the wilderness, and we have 2 campuses, and we get them out hiking and paddling. We do a lot of sort of hands-on work. We actually have students here right now doing a course on deer ecology and anthropology, and students are shadowing us as hunters. And when we bring home a deer, we skin it and butcher it with students, really give them that visceral.
Oh, are you there, Zach? We'll do it again. Hang on, people.
Usually we have a clear connection, so thank you for your patience.
Oh, yeah, no worries. And thank you, audience, for your patience. And we'll let Zach continue on with what he was saying.
So we have at Tidelines Institute, we have a program, bringing students into the heart of the wilderness. It involves getting them out hiking and kayaking and doing work with, we have students filleting salmon and butchering deer and doing basic carpentry and really working with their hands, learning where their food comes from. And then a big part of it, too, is hitting them with the reality of the climate crisis and all it threatens, and what are the real tools that the climate movement is using to move us beyond the fossil fuel era. So that's what I'm doing now. I've moved from climate science towards climate education and activism.
And action, it sounds like you're committing to a lot of action. So I want to get right into the meat of things and ask you a question about probably a 2-pronged question. One, how did we get here? Were we not paying attention? Did this happen overnight? And why? Well, answer that one first.
Great. Yes. How did we get to this point where we are in a full-blown 4-alarm climate crisis? Why has my parents' generation and my generation failed, so catastrophically to act? This is just what I was observing as I was doing science and realizing that there was just far too little action, and that's why I left. Well, to tell that story, we go back a few decades, and it was the consequences that we're seeing now, whether that's Hurricane Helene and Milton, devastating large swaths of the American Southeast, causing hundreds of billions of dollars in damage and costing hundreds of lives. These damages were entirely predictable, and in fact, they have been predicted by climate scientists for decades. It was 1988 when pioneering climate scientist James Hansen testified before U.S. Congress that he knew with 99% certainty that humans were warming the planet through carbon emissions, through burning fossil fuels. 1988, I was 3 years old at that time. Now my head is covered in gray hair, and prematurely gray, but gray nonetheless. So, in that time, in the 3.5 decades since James Hansen delivered the scientific consensus to our leaders and urged them to act, have we fixed this thing? Yeah, not even close. In fact, humans have poured more carbon into the atmosphere since James Hansen's testimony than in all previous human history. In other words, we've done more damage to the climate knowingly than we ever did in ignorance. And so the question, of course, is why? How on earth did that happen? And the reason is, not to put too fine a point on it, that there's a core tension at the heart of the climate crisis. We know, and we have known for decades, that we need to stop burning fossil fuels in order to end this crisis. But there are very powerful forces who do not want us to stop burning fossil fuels because they are profiting so handsomely off those fossil fuels, primarily fossil fuel industry. So I'll read you a quotation. This is a memo from the Exxon head of corporate research in 1988. It reads, quote, "If a worldwide consensus emerges that action is needed to mitigate against greenhouse gas effects, substantial negative impacts on Exxon could occur." In other words, if the world fixes this problem, we're going to be making less profit. And the fossil fuel industry has mobilized with incredible success to block climate action. And they've done that in a variety of ways. One of those is to foment climate change denial, right in the tradition of the tobacco industry a generation before, who were lying about the damages that their products caused. The fossil fuel industry has spent many millions to muddy the science, to try to emphasize the uncertainty, to try to turn this into a debate. The science isn't settled, so there's no reason for us to act. And I've been a target of this myself. My very own science was twisted and perverted by the forces of climate change denial, which have very large bankrolls behind them. So beyond just changing public opinion to try to convince people that this is a hoax, is their political power. We have a political system in which the wealthiest individuals and corporations can throw, as they have this cycle, hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign donations at their favorite climate-denying politicians. And then once they get into office, the fossil fuel industry throws hundreds of millions of dollars more into lobbying those politicians to block action. And they've just been incredibly successful at this. They have blocked climate action at every level for decades, from local to international. And it was just devastating to me when I learned about this, just the decades-long crusade to cast doubt on the science and to block action in order to protect their own profits. It's really not a stretch to say that they are destroying our futures for their own profit. And it's very well documented by many of our best investigative journalists, by many investigations through the government process. But here we are. They have been so successful at blocking action that we have wasted the crucial decades, and now we're at a point where we need to cut carbon emissions extremely quickly in order to reach the climate goals under the United Nations process that the world has set out. And big oil is still to this day just doubling down. They are not moving away from fossil fuels. They've been making record profits, especially as energy prices have gone up in the wake of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and they have no intention of moving away from fossil fuels, even 4 decades after the scientific consensus was revealed. The great irony here is that ExxonMobil's own scientists were on the vanguard of this climate science research. They were some of the ones who understood first that carbon emissions from the burning of fossil fuels would warm the planet and that would be catastrophic for humanity. And Exxon's management took those warnings very seriously, actually. They started building their drill rigs offshore higher in order to compensate for the sea level rise that they knew was happening. But they didn't tell the rest of us. They told the rest of us a highly coordinated series of lies and blocked action through the political process. So this is the number one barrier to climate action, and the climate movement is really working now to disempower the fossil fuel industry, to take them out of the driver's seat so that our solutions can move forward and can flourish.
And that's exactly the next step I wanted to go to, Zach. The picture you painted is somewhat dismal. I mean, it's really frightening, but it seems like there is a possibility that our hands are tied. So what can we do to combat this industry who wants a cash cow instead of protection?
Thank you for that question. This is where the bread and butter, of course. Where are our solutions, given that the number one barrier to climate action is the obstruction and denial from the fossil fuel industry? How do we combat that? Well, we have this persistent narrative about, we should be doing this on an individual basis. They call it the personal carbon footprint. If you just turn out the lights and take shorter showers and buy the organic yogurt, why, that's the best you can do. This is one of the real mind blowers for my student groups when I talk with them, is that the whole concept of the personal carbon footprint is a fossil fuel industry fabrication brought to us by BP in a $100 million ad campaign in 2005. And, the reason that they did this was to shift the blame away from themselves, who were blocking action at the highest level, and shift it onto the consumer. What the personal carbon footprint says is, this is your fault for using fossil fuels, and the only way to fix it is to fix yourself. Because as long as people are fixated on fixing themselves, why, they will try desperately to stop using fossil fuels in a fossil fuel-based system, which is impossible, and they will not work together to fix that system, which is, of course, what we really need to do. What we need is not personal action as much as collective action through movement building. Think of the way that social change has happened throughout the 20th century. The Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was not going around asking individuals to fix their discrimination footprint, by each white person should give one compliment a day to a black person. No, they were building power through a collective movement that then was demanding legal equality at the highest level, to the point that, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You can go through the list of big social changes: the gay rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the suffragettes who won the vote for women in this country, the Indian independence movement led by Mohandas Gandhi. All of these social changes were won not by individuals taking, these token actions to try to fix themselves and be pure. They were won by movements, by collective action. And that's exactly how that's going to happen for the climate movement as well.
Let me interrupt you for a second, Zach, and say, I want to talk further about the fossil fuel industry and that course of action to address them. But the way you say it, it sounds like people don't need to take personal action at all. Is that what you're saying? Or is it something that both has to happen? It's just more important that we introduce legislation and curtail the fossil fuel industry's quest for profit.
It's everything all at once. I would certainly not discourage people from recycling and from taking shorter showers, as long as you realize when you're doing those things that these tools have been given to you by the fossil fuel industry in the form of the personal carbon footprint, specifically to make you ineffective agents of change, because you're going to be working at a personal level rather than organizing. And so, it's not that recycling is a bad thing. It's just that it's so woefully inadequate to address the crisis that we face. We've been talking about recycling and other personal actions for 4 decades, and in that time, carbon emissions have skyrocketed. And the reason is because it is a systemic crisis, that the laws of this country are built around the burning of fossil fuels, and individuals cannot change that. I'll give you an example. In Arizona, right now, Arizona is the sunniest state in the union. You would think, gosh, Arizona should be a solar superpower. When you look across Flagstaff, when you look across Phoenix, when you fly into these airports, you should see solar panels everywhere. But you don't. In fact, Massachusetts has far more installed solar panels than Arizona does. How can we account for this? It's because the laws in Arizona are written specifically to favor fossil fuels because, I don't mean to get partisan here, but when we talk about the regulators of the electric utilities and gas utilities, known as the Arizona Corporation Commission. Most people have not heard of the Arizona Corporation Commission, but they have tremendous power because they regulate where does Arizona's electrical power come from. Does it come from coal and gas, or does it come from solar? And right now, the Arizona Corporation Commission is dominated by 4 Republicans, and there's 1 Democrat. And the votes continually go 4-1 against solar. they are continually voting for the interests of fossil fuels rather than for solar. This is not some individuals have no choice about where their electrical power comes from. These utilities are monopolies, and they are regulated by the Arizona Corporation Commission. Well, guess what? 3 of those commissioners are up for election right now. It is possible to install a pro-solar majority in the Arizona Corporation Commission that would move the state rapidly towards renewable energy. But as long as it is, Republican climate-denying, election-denying, ideologues in those positions of power, Arizona will not move towards solar. So that's what, that movements, or one of the many tools that movements have at their disposal is political organizing to put the right climate champions into power.
Well, we're about to run out of time, and so there's a couple of things I want to get to. One is action that you would like to see people take right now and in the future continue to do. And 2, I was wondering if your students are nearby and we can get them around the phone to all holler, and so we can say hello to them and they can say hello to us.
Ha! I love that thought. Our students are all out shadowing hunters in the woods right now. But in terms of, I wish I had a little more time. We got cut off on the phone, of course. A little more time to talk about the solutions and the real tools that the climate movement is using. But I'll just say, so first of all, 11...
Excuse me. We can go a little bit over. So go ahead and talk. And I'm going to say right now, you're tuned to KSZN LP Flagstaff 101.5 FM, streaming on radiosunnyside.org. So we got the legal ID out of the way. So go ahead, Zach.
Wonderful. So in terms of actions that we can take for the next 11 days, boy do Arizonans have a lot of power right now. Obviously, a major swing state in the presidential election. I suspect that most people listening to this show are already planning to vote. But, that one vote, again, that's the personal level of action, right? Anyone listening to this call could get 5 people to vote or 10 people to vote by, organizing and joining a few shifts. So this is a really crucial, that doesn't even do it justice. It's existential, this election. At the presidential level, there's a lot of state-level decisions being made in Arizona as well. And as I mentioned, the Arizona Corporation Commission that will decide, is Arizona just going to continue to squander all of that great sunshine that's raining down, or is it going to become a solar superpower? That's what's at stake in this election. So that political organizing, that's a really key tool of the climate movement. But it's not the only one. There are other tools, collective tools, again, that the climate movement is using to disempower the fossil fuel industry and move us beyond the fossil fuel era. One of those is what we might call stopping the money pipeline. The big banks, the big financial managers, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Vanguard, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, all of them are putting billions of dollars into fossil fuels still today, because still today fossil fuels are profitable. And the big banks see this and they want to get in on the game. Well, they are financing climate destruction, and that has to happen. And so a big part of the climate movement is pressuring these big banks and money managers change their lending practices to put capital towards our future, our energy future, rather than what's killing us. This is something that can be considered on the household level, too. Bank Forward estimates that if you have just $125,000 in the mainstream banking system, that money just sitting there is doing more damage to the climate than all your other activities, flying on planes, driving your car, ordering Amazon packages, because that money is being used to finance fracked gas pipelines. And so one of the, if you're going to take action at the personal or household level, let it be not buying the organic yogurt, let it be moving your money, which is to somewhere climate friendly, which is an actual really effective step Another tool that the climate movement is using, which it's a certain part of the climate movement, is the actual blocking the path of the bulldozers, pipeline protests. These, the beautiful power of nonviolent protest, that is one of the tools. Also, litigation. This is one of the key tools that the climate movement is using. Cities and states all across the United States and beyond are suing big oil for damages. Consider this. Last year, in 2023, the United States suffered a record number of billion-dollar climate disasters, 28 of them to be exact. And this year, 2024, is on pace to exceed that. More and more climate disasters. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in damages. And the question is, who should have to pay all those damages? Is it you and me, the taxpayers, or is it the companies that have made trillions of dollars in profits over decades off making this crisis worse while lying about it? And that's what these lawsuits allege. They're trying to hold big oil accountable for their lies and obstruction, and trying to make the polluter pay for the damages that they have caused. And so those lawsuits are proliferating, and they're working their way through the courts, and it's only a matter of time before they start to land. Unfortunately, time is exactly what we're short on in this movement.
Now, I heard you say that there are many efforts that are not worthwhile. Well, I shouldn't say, you didn't say not worthwhile. You said they're not making as much of an impact as simply leaving your money in the bank, for example, because it's funding the fossil fuel industry. Is there something to be said about raising the awareness where certain products, I can't think of the word, things that make the products that we buy? For example, plastic. Plastic is such a big deal. But most people do not make the connection between the fossil fuel industry extracting the oil, shipping it to the factory that makes the plastic, and then shipping it to the retail outlet that sells the plastic. So is there that's just one example, but is there anything to people being aware of that so that they feel more empowered to take on the fossil fuel industry? Is that what got the cigarette industry to admit, okay, this smoking can cause cancer? Because we ended up with, warning labels on cigarette packs. Education has done far more than that. Is that something that will spur people to action? And what do you think will spur people to action?
This is the central question of my life's work, is how to inspire and empower people towards action. And that's what I try to do at Tidelines Institute. And there's, you're absolutely right to think about plastics. Big oil, they know that eventually the world is going to move towards renewables. They're going to try to make that transition as slow as possible, but now they're trying to just open up as many plastics factories as they can. This is their lifeline, is to just flood the world with another global scourge, which is plastic, instead of coal, oil, and gas. So anyway, they're not going to stop. So to the question, how do we inspire, how do we empower? I think I don't have a perfect answer for that. When I've worked with hundreds of students here at Tidelines Institute, and some of them take this experience and go on and become real climate leaders who are taking real action, and some of them don't, and that's fine, and people are complex. But I think what I have found is a potent mix, is talking about or experiencing love for the natural world, love for community, and the kinds of things that are threatened by the climate crisis. We lead from a place of love. I want my son, who's now 18 months old, I want him to have salmon still running up the rivers here in Alaska by the time he's old enough to catch them. That's love, and that's a motivator. And then there's a second motivator, which is anger. I have sleepless nights of rage against the fossil fuel industry, which is truly choosing their own profits over a habitable planet. And that mix of love and anger, I find that when people have both those things in their bellies, they can go make some powerful things happen.
Wow, I agree with that the combination of those two things are usually what spur the action that we're looking for. Yeah. So thank you very much. Is there a parting thought you have?
Parting thought, hey, 11 days until the biggest election of our lives. So you as Arizonans, get out there and hit the streets, hit the phones. You might think, oh, my neighborhood is already going to be voting for climate. Well, the margins matter everywhere. Just because Flagstaff is going to be blue, it matters whether Flagstaff is 81% blue or 82% blue. So everybody's got a role to play, and hopefully we're going to wake up on November 6th, and we're going to be charting a course towards our renewable energy future.
All right, sounds great. Well, thank you very much for joining us on Spotlight on Climate. Dr. Zach Brown from the Tidelines Institute in Glacier Bay, Alaska, and get out your map and look up where that is. It's a beautiful, beautiful area, and I appreciate the comments that you made about the Arctic and the Antarctic being the ground zero for everything that's happening right now. So, yeah, we're all continue to work hard, and thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thanks very much for having me.
You're welcome. Have a great day. Dr. Zach Brown coming to us from the Tidelines Institute on Spotlight on Climate on KSDN.
Spotlight on Climate is brought to you by the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance in conjunction with 101.5 FM Radio Sunnyside. Our host is Talyne Corlyn. This broadcast is produced by David Bull. Stephen Summers serves as executive producer. For feedback to Spotlight on Climate, or to learn more about the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, visit nazcca.org.